The human colony ship Perseverance tumbled out of the wormhole like a drunk falling through a doorway. Alarms screaming and lights flashing across every console on the bridge. Captain Sarah. Chen gripped her command chair as the ship stabilized, watching the view screen flicker back to life and show something impossible. A planet that looked like it had been carved from obsidian and gold, surrounded by orbital structures so massive they could swallow Earth's moonhole navigation. Where the hell are we? Chen asked, her voice steady, despite the chaos. Lieutenant Marcus. Webb stared at his console like it had personally insulted him and shook his head in confusion. Ma'am, I have no idea, and our star charts show absolutely nothing, he said while frantically swiping through display after display of data. That made zero sense to him or anyone else on the bridge. Chief Engineer Rodriguez's voice crackled over the intercom from somewhere deep in the ship's mechanical guts, where he lived most days anyway. Captain, that wormhole wasn't on any map because it shouldn't exist, he explained, with the exasperation of a man who had just watched physics break its own rules right in front of him, and then laugh about it afterward. Before Chen could respond, the view screen lit up with new contacts, and not just a few of them, but dozens of massive warships that made their colony. Vessel looked like a rowboat next to aircraft carriers. The ships were beautiful in a terrible way, all sharp angles and dark metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Covered in symbols that hurt to look at. Too long. Incoming transmission, announced Communications Officer Park, her fingers already working to decode whatever alien language was about to demand their surrender or destruction, or possibly both at the same time. The view screen shifted to show a being that could only be described as vaguely reptilian, if reptiles. Wore armor made of what looked like crystallized darkness and had eyes that glowed with cold contempt. Unknown vessel. You have violated Imperial space, the alien said in perfect English that somehow carried an accent of pure disdain mixed with boredom that spoke of having given this speech 10,000 times before to 10,000 different doomed species. You will surrender your ship, your crew, and all autonomous rights immediately, or face total annihilation. The alien continued like he was reading from the galaxy's most depressing script. We are the Zeltheran Empire, masters of 7,000 worlds and breakers of 1,000,000 rebellions. And you are nothing before us, he added with the casual certainty of someone who had never been contradicted in his entire life. Chen glanced at Webb, who was barely suppressing a smile that really had no business being on his face during what was technically a first contact situation with a hostile alien empire. Yeah, we've had worse Mondays, Chen said after a moment of consideration, and then added almost as an afterthought. Can we get a navigation beacon, though, because our charts don't show this sector at all and we're kind of lost? The Zeltheron's eyes widened slightly, which was apparently the alien equivalent of complete shock based on how the other aliens visible behind him suddenly started gesturing frantically. You do not comprehend your situation, the alien said, recovering his composure with visible effort that suggested this conversation was not going according to the usual script at all. You are surrounded by the Imperial fleet. You are helpless before our might, and you face certain death if you do not comply immediately with all demands, he explained slowly, like he was talking to a particularly stupid child who needed the danger spelled out in very small words. Chun nodded politely and gestured for Park to mute their audio for a moment. Medical? Is everyone okay down there? She asked over the internal comms door. Amara Okafor's calm voice came back immediately, with the kind of steady tone that only came from years of dealing with much worse than angry aliens. We're fine, Captain. A few bumps and bruises, but nothing serious, she reported, and then added, Are we being invaded or something, because I'm hearing a lot of ominous threatening over the speakers? Working on it, Chen said, and then unmuted the channel to the increasingly impatient-looking Zeltheran, who had apparently been continuing his threats the whole time they weren't listening. The alien had shifted tactics, and the view screen now showed holographic displays of burning worlds and species that looked like they were begging for mercy. That never came mountains of skulls from 100 different alien races were arranged in artistic patterns that suggested the Zeltherons took their atrocities very seriously as both military, strategy, and performance art. Behold the fate of those who defied the Empire, the Zeltheran declared with dramatic flair that would have done a theater major. Proud we have broken species older than your sun and crushed civilizations that spanned galaxies. He continued, while the holograms shifted to show progressively more disturbing scenes of subjugation and destruction. Webb leaned over to Chen and whispered just loud enough for the bridge crew to hear him clearly, "Is this the part where they threaten our families?" He asked with genuine curiosity, because that's what the Nazis did and the Soviets, and honestly like 12 different groups just in the 20th century. Alone, he added thoughtfully, the Zeltheran paused mid-threat. Clearly having heard the comment, despite it being intended as a quiet, "Aside, your historical references mean nothing," he said, but there was a note of uncertainty creeping into his voice now. "You will be taken aboard our flagship for processing and cataloging," he declared, apparently deciding to move past the part where the humans were supposed to be terrified and skip straight to the imprisonment phase. "Your primitive vessel will be seized, and your crew will be evaluated for potential use or disposal," he added with the kind of casual cruelty that suggested he didn't expect any resistance to this plan whatsoever. Chun considered their options, which were basically limited to getting blown up now or getting captured and possibly blown up later. And the second option at least gave them time to figure out what was happening. "All right, I'll comply," she said, and then added, "But we need supplies, and especially star charts, because we actually have no idea how to get home from wherever here is." The Zeltheran looked like he wanted to argue, but settled for a curt nod that suggested he was already regretting this entire interaction. "You will be escorted to the Eternal Dominion," he said, pronouncing the ship's name like it should mean something terrifying. "Resistance will result in immediate vaporization," he added, apparently unable to help himself from including at least one more threat as the transmission cut off and the alien warships began moving into escort positions around the Perseverance. Rodriguez's voice came over the intercom again. "Captain, are we seriously just flying into the evil Empire's flagship?" he asked with the kind of resigned tone that suggested he already knew the answer. "Do we have a choice?" Chen replied, "Not really." Rodriguez admitted, "Then yes, we're flying into the evil Empire's flagship," she confirmed. Webb pulled up what little data they'd gathered on the alien vessels and shook his head in amazement. "You know what's funny?" he said to no one in particular. "They've got technology centuries ahead of ours, ships that could crack planets, and an empire spanning thousands of worlds," he continued, "and they still feel the need to threaten people with torture and destruction like they're insecure about something," he finished. Shen smiled despite herself, because he was right, and there was something almost human about that need to overcompensate. The Perseverance moved slowly toward the massive flagship ahead while the crew prepared for whatever came next with the kind of calm that came from being a species that had survived ice ages, world wars, and reality television. The Eternal Dominion's docking bay was designed to intimidate, and it did an excellent job of looking like the kind of place where hope went to die and possibly get recycled into floor polish. The walls were black metal etched with scenes of conquest and suffering, lit by a red glow that pulsed like a diseased heartbeat, while automated weapons tracked every movement from the ceiling with the patient attention of predators who knew their prey had nowhere to run. Captain Chen led her crew down the Perseverance's ramp and took in the welcome committee of armed Zeltheran soldiers who stood in perfect formation with weapons that hummed with barely restrained violence. Atmospheric pressure is breathable, temperature is tolerable, and the gravity is only slightly higher than Earth normal, Dr. O'Coffer murmured, while checking her scanner, "though the decor is giving me a headache," she added dryly. A Zeltheran in more ornate armor stepped forward, his scales a deeper black than the others and marked with scars that looked deliberately maintained as badges of honor. "I am Lord Vexler, Interrogator Prime of the Zeltheran Empire," he announced with a kind of voice that suggested he enjoyed his job far too much. "You will follow me to the processing chambers where you will be evaluated, cataloged, and broken," he continued. "Matter of factly broken?" Rodriguez asked with genuine interest, "like broken into smaller groups or broken psychologically, because that second one usually takes a while. He clarified, helpful. Ixathor's eyes narrowed in what might have been confusion or annoyance, or possibly both at the same time. You will understand soon enough, he said cryptically, and then turned to lead them deeper into the ship. The corridors of the Eternal Dominion were a masterclass in psychological warfare through architecture. Alone, every turn revealed new horrors. Transparent chambers containing aliens in various states of torment, walls covered in weapons from 1,000 conquered species, and holograms showing the Zelthiran Empire's greatest hits of genocide and subjugation. The crew walked past all of it with the kind of detached interest usually reserved for particularly boring museum exhibits that's actually pretty inefficient. Webb commented while pointing at a torture device that looked like it combined electricity with some kind of acid bath. You'd get better results with just the electricity if you varied the voltage unpredictably, he explained like he was critiquing someone's home renovation choices. The acid is just for show, which is fine, I guess, but it seems wasteful. He added thought. Flivlixter stopped walking and turned to stare at Webb with an expression that suggested his entire worldview was experiencing some kind of error. You analyze the efficiency of torture devices? He asked slowly. Well, yeah. Webb replied with a shrug. We had a whole period called the Inquisition where people got really creative with this stuff and wrote detailed manuals about it. Explained then, we did it again during World War II and the Cold War, and honestly, torture efficiency is kind of a recurring theme in human history. He continued casually. The Zelthiran interrogator seemed to file this information away for later, and resumed walking toward their destination with slightly less confidence than before. They arrived at a massive chamber that could only be called the Chamber of Eternal Screaming, based on the large sign above the door that literally said, Chamber of Eternal Screaming, in multiple languages, including English somehow, were crystalline pillars containing the digitized consciousness of what Vexler proudly explained were defeated enemy leaders who existed in perpetual psychological torment designed to break even the strongest minds. They experience every fear, every regret, every moment of suffering, amplified 1,000-fold for all eternity. Vexler said with the pride of an artist showing off his masterpiece. They beg for death, but death will never come, he added dramatically. Chief Engineer Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully and walked around one of the pillars, examining it from different angles with professional interest. We had something kind of like this in ancient Greece called the Brazen Bull, he said while tapping the crystal experimentally. They'd lock people inside a hollow bronze bull and light a fire underneath it. He explained the person would basically be roasted alive, and their screams would come out sounding like bull noises. He continued matter-of-factly. At least you're honest about it being torture instead of calling it enhanced interrogation or national security, he finished with a slight smile. Vexler's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. As he tried to process this response, do you not fear death? He demanded. Do you not fear suffering? He added with rising frustration. Captain Chen stepped forward before Rodriguez could launch into a lecture about humanity's complicated relationship with mortality. Look, she said in the patient tone of someone explaining something to a confused customer, we're from a planet where nature tried to kill us daily with diseases, predators, weather, and sometimes the ground just opening up and swallowing entire cities. She began, we invented nuclear weapons and pointed them at ourselves for like 50 years just to see who would blink first. She continued, we survived multiple plagues by drinking mercury as medicine because we didn't know any better. She added, one of our most popular sports involves people giving each other brain damage for entertainment, and we pay them millions to do it. She said, your torture chamber is horrifying, sure, but it's not like surprising or anything. She finished with a questioning tone that suggested she was genuinely trying to be diplomatic about it. The Chamber of Eternal Screaming suddenly seemed a lot quieter as Vexler stood in stunned silence. Okafor raised her hand like she was in class. I have a question about your bioweapon development program, she said politely. Do you have facilities we could tour? She asked with professional interest. I'm writing a comparative paper on pandemic responses across civilizations, and I'd love to see how you're engineered. Pathogens compared to Earth's Black Death or the Spanish flu. She explained enthusiastically, for historical reference, she added when Vexler continued to stare at her in what appeared to be disbelief. Vexathor Finally found his voice again after what felt like an eternity of processing you. Compare our weapons to your own history, like they are equivalent. He said slowly, they are diseases and torture devices. Chen replied, we've had both for thousands of years. Honestly, yours are more advanced technologically, but conceptually, they're pretty similar. It's the stuff we came up with when we were still figuring out agriculture. She explained, what I'm trying to say is that you're not showing us anything we haven't already done to ourselves. She clarified, the interrogator prime of the Zeltheran Empire, breaker of 1,000 species and architect of suffering beyond measure, looked at the small group of humans in his chamber of horrors and felt something he had not experienced in centuries of service to the Empire. Complete and utter confusion. Take them to the isolation cells. Finally said to his guards, I need to consult with the High Council about this. He added quietly, as the humans were led away to what was supposed to be a psychologically devastating imprisonment. Webb leaned over to Rodriguez. I think we broke him, he whispered. Yeah, probably, Rodriguez agreed. Is that good or bad? Webb asked. I have absolutely no idea. Rodriguez admitted cheerfully behind them. Vexter stood alone in the Chamber of Eternal, screaming, and wondered for the first time in his long career if perhaps the Empire had finally encountered something it was not equipped to handle. A species that had already survived everything the galaxy could possibly throw at them by virtue of having thrown it at themselves first. Activated his communicator and prepared to deliver a report that he knew the High Council would find impossible to believe the humans. Meanwhile, we're already settling into their cells with the resigned competence of people who had watched enough prison movies to know how this usually went, and were mostly just hoping for decent food. The Zeltheran High Council chamber orbited the throne world in its own dedicated station, a structure built to inspire awe and terror in equal measure. Through its sheer scale and the artistic arrangement of conquered vessels embedded in its hull, like trophies, 12 members of the council sat in elevated seats arranged in a circle, each representing a different aspect of the Empire's administrative brutality. And all of them were currently staring at Lord Vexler like he had just announced the laws of physics were taking a vacation. Explain again? Demanded Council Member Zarkith, whose title translated roughly to Minister of Psychological Dominance. How a species with no knowledge of the Empire, no advanced weapons, and no apparent military advantage has completely resisted every breaking protocol we possess, she continued. With barely contained frustration, Vexer stood in the center of the circle and wished desperately that he was back in his torture chambers, where things made sense and people screamed. Appropriately, when subjected to horrifying stimuli, they compare everything we do to their own history. He explained again when shown our conquest records. They referenced something called World War II, he said, when threatened with biological warfare. They discussed their own plagues with academic interest. He continued, when subjected to isolation and psychological pressure, they organized the other prisoners into what they call a union. He finished, weekly a union. Asked Council Member Drexener, Minister of Subject Species Compliance, a collective organization where prisoners negotiate for better treatment.
Dexter
Explained they have somehow convinced 17 different species to work together, despite those species having been enemies for centuries before their capture. He added they introduced concepts like voting and democratic committees and something called workers' rights. He said within 2 weeks they had better food rations and started an education program teaching other prisoners about Earth history, which somehow makes everyone more resistant to our breaking protocols. He concluded miserably, the council sat in stunned silence for a long moment, and we cannot simply execute them because, prompted Council Member Vexvera, whose entire job was finding creative ways to make examples of problematic individuals. Because every time we threaten execution, they ask if we are going to make it public or quick, Vexler said. Then they discuss human execution methods throughout history in detail that suggest they have thought about this topic extensively. He added one of them, the engineer actually, suggested improvements to our disintegration chambers. That would make them more efficient, and we tested his suggestions, and he was correct. He admitted quietly the silence that followed this admission was deafening furthermore. Vexler continued, because apparently his day could get worse, word of the humans has spread throughout the Empire. He said carefully subject species are hearing rumors of beings who do not fear the Zeltherans. He explained, "There are reports of resistance movements calling themselves humans, even though they have never met one." He added, "It is becoming a symbol." He finished. Council member Zarkith leaned forward with an expression that suggested she was reconsidering her entire career path. A symbol of what exactly? She asked dangerously of resistance. Vexter admitted of the possibility that the Empire is not invincible. He said of the idea that fear can be overcome. He concluded the council erupted into argument immediately, with half demanding the humans be destroyed as an example, and the other half insisting they be studied to understand how to counter this unexpected psychological immunity. The debate was still raging when the Empress herself entered the chamber, and everyone fell silent. Instantly, Empress Shalvix was old even by Zeltharan standards, and had ruled the Empire for 3 centuries through a combination of brilliant strategy and absolute ruthlessness that made Vexter look like an amateur. "Bring me the human captain," she commanded simply. "I will speak with her myself," she added. "Your Majesty, is that wise?" asked Sarkith carefully. "When I want your opinion on wisdom, I will have it extracted from your neural tissue." The Empress replied pleasantly, "Bring me the human." She repeated an hour later. Captain Sarah Chen stood in the Empress's private audience chamber, which was surprisingly understated compared to the rest of the Zeltharan aesthetic, and decorated in what could almost be called tasteful if you ignored the weapons display that covered one entire wall. "Captain Chen," the Empress said without preamble, "you are causing problems." She stated flatly, "We really didn't mean to." Chen replied honestly, "We were just trying to get home, and then you surrounded us and brought us here." She explained, "And then you kept trying to scare us, and we kept not being scared." She continued, "And honestly, that seems like more of a you problem than a US problem." She finished diplomatically. The Empress studied Chen for a long moment with eyes that had seen empires rise and fall. "I am offering you a position," she finally said. "Become the Empire's enforcers." She proposed you claim to be unafraid of violence and suffering. She continued, "Use that strength in my service." Now she offered, "I will give you wealth beyond measure, technology beyond your current understanding, power over worlds." She promised your people will become the Empire's elite. She concluded. Chun considered the offer seriously because it was clearly meant as a genuine attempt at recruitment rather than a trick. "We appreciate the offer, Your Majesty." She began carefully, "But we've seen what happens when one group decides they're naturally superior to others." She explained, "Spoiler alert, it never ends well for anybody, including the group in charge." She added, "You truly believe you could resist the entire Empire?" the Empress asked. With what might have been amusement, Chun shook her head no. "We'd probably lose eventually." She admitted honestly, "But here's the thing." She continued, "We once fought a war that killed 3% of our entire species over whether people could own other people," she said. "Then the winners built a weapon that could end all life on our planet, and we built thousands of them just to make sure everyone knew we were serious about not using them." She explained, "We're not saying we'd win." She clarified, "We're saying we're too crazy to make the math work in your favor." She finished. The Empress actually laughed at that, a sound that Vexter, who was monitoring from outside the chamber, had never heard before in 3 decades of service. "You are either very brave or very stupid." The Empress observed, "Probably both." Chen agreed cheerfully, "Your Majesty, can I ask you something?" She ventured, "You may ask." The Empress allowed, "Why do you need an empire built on fear?" Chen asked directly, "You clearly have incredible technology and organizational ability." She said, "You could probably accomplish a lot through cooperation instead of conquest." She suggested, "But you choose fear and suffering." She noted why. She finished simply. The Empress's expression hardened because fear is reliable. She said, "Coldly cooperation requires trust, and trust is a weakness, exploited by the first ambitious species to arise." She explained, "Fear keeps order." She stated, "Fear prevents chaos." She added, "Fear is control." She concluded, "Fear is also expensive," Chen countered. "You have to maintain it constantly." She pointed out, "You have to keep escalating to maintain the same effect." She said, "And eventually you end up in an empire where you can't trust anyone and everyone is waiting for you to show weakness." She explained, "That sounds exhausting." She finished sympathetically. The Empress stood abruptly. "Returned to your holding area." She commanded, "I will consider our conversation," she said dismissively as Chen was escorted out. The Empress stood alone in her chamber and looked at the wall of weapons from 1,000 defeated enemies for the first time in decades.
I wondered
If perhaps the Empire's greatest weapon might also be its greatest weakness. Meanwhile, in orbit around 36 worlds throughout the Empire, rebellions that had been simmering for years suddenly erupted into open warfare. The rebels fought with a new determination, crying out strange battle cries in a language none of them knew. Fight like humans. They shouted as they charged Imperial forces. Die like humans. They screamed as they refused to surrender. And throughout the Empire, the Zeltharan military forces found themselves facing something they had never encountered before: enemies who were not afraid to lose. The rebellion spread like fire through dry grass, and the Zeltharan Empire discovered something terrifying. Fear only works as a weapon until someone decides to stop being afraid. On the mining world of Kexler 9, workers who had labored in silence for generations suddenly refused to enter the mines, and when the overseers threatened them with the usual punishments, the workers just laughed and said they were being human. About Eton, the agricultural planet of Render, farmers burned their own crops rather than send them to imperial storehouses, and declared they would rather starve free than eat well as slaves, which was apparently something humans had done multiple times throughout their history. The Zeltharan military responded with overwhelming force because that was the only response they knew, but they found their usual tactics suddenly ineffective against enemies who treated death as an acceptable outcome rather than the ultimate threat. Lord Vexler stood in an emergency session of the High Council and delivered his latest report with the exhausted tone of someone who had stopped being surprised by bad news. 37 worlds are in open rebellion. He announced another 72 show signs of imminent uprising. Continued. Imperial forces have achieved tactical victories on 16 worlds, but the rebels simply retreat and regroup using guerrilla tactics that our databases have no record of, he explained. When we interrogate captured rebels, they claim to be following human military doctrine, he added, but the humans are still in our custody, so how are the rebels learning these tactics? Demanded Drexner. They are not learning them, Vexler said carefully. They are inventing them based on the concept of humans. He explained the idea of a species that fights without fear has become more powerful than the actual species. He continued, we have created a symbol we cannot destroy because it exists in the minds of our subjects. He concluded, grimly impressed. Shalvex listened to the report with an expression that revealed nothing. I am implementing reforms, she announced suddenly. The Empire will transition to a more cooperative model of governance. She said subject species will be given representation in imperial decisions. She continued, we will reduce punitive measures and increase beneficial administration. She stated the council erupted in immediate protest, but the Empress silenced them with a gesture. The alternative is watching the Empire tear itself apart. She said coldly, we have ruled through fear for millennia, but the humans have shown us the flaw in that strategy. She explained, fear only works until it does not. She noted then it becomes a liability. She finished. Council member Thexvera stood abruptly, and his scales flushed with anger. You would betray everything the Empire stands for because of one primitive species. He demanded I would save the Empire from its own obsolete thinking. The Empress replied sharply, if you cannot see the necessity of adaptation, then perhaps you are the obsolete element. Adasolete. She added dangerously. Thexavar glared at the Empress and then stormed from the chamber, followed by 3 other council members, who apparently shared his views on the sanctity of traditional imperial brutality. Your Majesty, Vexler said carefully after they had gone, you may have just created a different problem, he suggested. I am aware, the Empress said tiredly, but I would rather face a coup attempt from my own military than watch the Empire collapse under the weight of universal rebellion. She explained the coup attempt came 3 days later when Admiral Kreshfer of the Imperial Fleet declared the Empress unfit to rule and announced his intention to restore traditional values through whatever force proved necessary. Half the Imperial Fleet sided with him immediately, along with approximately 60% of the ground forces and most of the council members who had not already been arrested for suspected disloyalty. Empress found herself with a smaller but still significant military force and the dubious advantage of actually being the legitimate ruler, which turned out to matter less than expected. When people were shooting at each other, the humans watched all of this unfold from their holding area, with the detached interest of people observing a train wreck they had accidentally caused. Should we feel bad about this? Webb asked, while monitoring the news broadcasts. Probably. Chen admitted. Are we going to... Rodriguez asked. Chen said with a shrug. The question became moot when Empress Chelvex herself appeared in their holding area, with a small guard detachment and an expression that suggested she was having the worst month of her very long life. I need your help, she said without preamble. The military faction is targeting civilian populations to force submission. She explained. They are doing exactly what you warned against. She continued. They are committing what you would call war crimes, she stated. Flatly, Chen exchanged looks with her crew and then stood to face the Empress directly. What exactly are you asking? She said carefully. Teach my forces how to fight. The Empress requested you claim humans are warriors by nature and history. She said prove it. She challenged. Help me stop this quickly before millions die. She added. Chen was quiet for a long moment while she considered the implications. If we do this, we do it our way, she finally said. No targeting civilians. No unnecessary cruelty. And when it's over, you actually follow through on those reforms. She stated firmly. Agreed. The Empress said immediately, then we'll help. Chen decided. Webb raised his hand like he was in class. We're not actually soldiers, he pointed out. Most of us are scientists and engineers and colonists. He explained. We know about military history, but we've never actually fought in wars ourselves. He clarified. Chen smiled grimly. Then, it's a good thing humans are really good at learning from our mistakes, she said, because we've made a lot of them and written them all down in excruciating detail, she added. The crew of the Perseverance became unlikely military advisors to an alien empress fighting a civil war against her own hardline military, and they approached it with the same practical competence they brought to everything else. Dr. Okafor analyzed the rebel imperial forces and identified their command structure weaknesses. Based on autocratic military organization that assumed perfect loyalty, Rodriguez examined their weapons and tactics and found them optimized for overwhelming firepower against terrified enemies, but vulnerable to dispersed resistance. Webb compiled every military doctrine humanity had ever written and started teaching Empress loyalist commanders about concepts like combined arms warfare, strategic depth, and acceptable losses. Chen coordinated everything and tried not to think too hard about the fact that they were teaching an alien empire how to fight a war using lessons learned from humanity's bloodiest conflicts. The first major battle after the humans got involved took place in orbit around a manufacturing world that both sides needed for its shipyards. Admiral Kreshfer deployed his forces in the traditional Zeltheran formation, a massive hammer blow designed to shatter enemy morale through overwhelming presence. The Empress's forces, following human advice, dispersed into smaller units and hit the flanks in coordinated strikes while avoiding the main strength entirely. The battle lasted 6 hours, instead of the usual 6 minutes, and ended with Kreshfer's forces retreating. For the first time in Zeltheran military history, because they had been systematically dismantled rather than confronted directly, you fight without honor. Kreshfer broadcast to the Empress after the battle, you fight for dominance. Chen replied, on the Empress's behalf we fight for survival, she said. There's a difference, she explained, when you fight to dominate. You can afford to be predictable because you assume your strength is enough. She continued, when you fight to survive, you have to be smarter because you know strength alone is not sufficient. She finished. The message was broadcast across all carrier channels and became an instant rallying cry for the Empress's forces over. The next several weeks the civil war continued, but the dynamics had shifted. Fundamentaliker's forces kept trying to win through superior firepower and intimidation, while the Wall Empress's forces used tactics that humanity had developed over thousands of years of fighting wars. It could not afford to lose. Ambushes, feints, false retreats, psychological operations, propaganda, and strategic targeting of supply lines all became standard practice for the loyalist forces. Lieutenant Webb found himself teaching alien commanders about something called the OO-DA loop: observe, orient, decide, act. The side that completes this cycle faster wins. He explained, "You have to get inside your enemy's decision-making process." He said, "Make them react to you instead of acting on their own initiative." He continued, "The aliens learned quickly because their survival depended on it. Dr. Okafor set up field hospitals and taught loyalist medical staff about triage and combat medicine because wars were not won by the side that fought hardest, but by the side that could keep fighting longest." Rodriguez trained engineers on rapid fortification and demolition techniques because controlling territory meant being able to deny it to your enemy when you could not hold it yourself, and through it all, Captain Chen coordinated with the Empress and tried to end the conflict as quickly as possible with minimal casualties, because that was the human way. Win fast, win decisively, and try not to create more problems than you solve, though given human history, that last part was definitely more aspirational than actual. The final battle of the Zeltharan Civil War took place above the throne world itself, where Admiral Kreshver had assembled his remaining forces for a desperate assault on the Imperial Palace. At 2/3 of his original fleet strength and the absolute certainty that traditional Zeltharan military doctrine would prevail, because it had prevailed for millennia, and some things were simply eternal. He was wrong about that last part. Empress's forces met him not with a direct confrontation, but with a battle plan that Captain Chen had adapted from something called the Battle of Canny, which had occurred on Earth roughly 2,000 years ago, and involved a smaller force completely encircling and destroying a larger army through superior tactics. The human crew watched from the Empress's flagship as the plan unfolded exactly as they had predicted, because military stupidity turned out to be universal across species. He is committing his reserves to the center, observed Webb while tracking the fleet movements, just like Varro at Canny. Rodriguez noted, "And now the flanks are closing." Dr. Okafor added, "This is kind of sad, actually." Webb said he has no idea what is about to happen. He continued, "Admiral Kreshver apparently realized what was happening about 3 minutes before his fleet was completely surrounded, and by then it was far too late to do anything except surrender or die. He chose surrender, which showed more sense than expected, and also meant the Civil War could actually end without requiring the complete destruction of the military forces that the Empire would need to maintain order afterward. Afterward, the Empress accepted his surrender personally and did not execute him immediately, which was apparently a radical departure from Zeltharan tradition, but which Chen had strongly recommended. You want to show that the new empire is different from the old one. She had explained that means showing mercy when you can afford it. She said, plus executing your defeated enemies just creates martyrs and prolongs conflicts. She added, humans learn that the hard way several times. She noted the war ended not with a massive bloodbath, but with negotiations and trials and the kind of messy political reconciliation that humans had gotten unfortunately good at throughout their history. Lord Vexter found himself appointed as Minister of Transitional Justice, which was apparently punishment for having started this whole mess by being too good at his job as torturer. His first task was interviewing Admiral Kreshver about his motivations for the coup attempt. The Empress was betraying everything we stood for, Kreshver said stubbornly, by trying to rule through cooperation instead of fear. Vexter asked. Yes, Kreshver replied. And you felt this was worth civil war? Vexter pressed. I felt it was worth preserving the Empire's strength, Kreshver. Vexter was quiet for a moment while he considered his response. The humans taught me something. He finally said, they taught me that strength is not the same as durability. He explained, we were strong, but we were not durable. He continued, the first real test of our system caused it to fracture. He noted that is not strength. He concluded that is brittleness. He finished. Kreshver had no response to that. Meanwhile, Captain Chen stood with the Empress in the newly reformed High Council chamber and watched as representatives from formerly subject species took their seats alongside Zeltharan officials. This is going to be messy. The Empress observed, democracy usually is. Chen agreed, but it is also surprisingly resilient. She added, when people have a stake in the system, they defend it. She explained, when they are just afraid of the system, they wait for it to fall. She said your old empire was always one good crisis away from collapse. She noted this one might actually last. She suggested the Empress looked at Chen with something that might have been respect, or possibly just exhaustion. The scientists have completed analysis of the wormhole that brought you here. She said they believe they can recreate it and send you home. She continued, you will be leaving then. She stated more than asked. Yeah. We've got people waiting for us, Chen said. Plus we've been gone for like 6 months and I really want to sleep in my own bed. She added, before you go, the Empress began, I want to understand something. She said your species has all this knowledge of warfare and suffering. She continued, you have experienced every horror we tried to inflict on you. She noted, yet you still helped us build something better. She said, why? She asked. Simply, Chen thought about it for a moment because we know how the other story ends. She finally said, we've been the empire that thought it was invincible. She explained, we've been the conquerors who ruled through fear. She continued, and every single time, it ended badly for everyone involved. She said, so when we see someone else heading down that path, we try to help them avoid it, she explained, even if they were trying to torture us like a week ago. The Empress asked with slight amusement, especially then. Chen replied, because holding grudges is how you get cyclical violence that lasts for generations. She said, and we've done enough of that already. She added. The Empress nodded slowly. Your species is very strange, she observed. Yeah, we get that a lot. Chen agreed cheerfully. 2 days later, the crew of the Perseverance stood in the same docking bay where they had first arrived and prepared to board their ship for the journey. A significant crowd had gathered to see them off, including Lord Vexther, who approached Captain Chen with something wrapped in dark cloth, a gift, he said formally, from the Empire to humanity. He explained. Chen unwrapped it carefully and found a data crystal that presumably contained information. It is everything, Vexther said. Every technology we possess, every scientific discovery, every historical record, he explained. The Empress wants your species to have it. He continued, consider it payment for services rendered, he added, and perhaps a reminder, he finished quietly, of what? Chen asked. That even the darkest empire can choose to become something better. Vexther said, if someone shows them it is possible, he concluded. Chen accepted the crystal with appropriate solemnity and then completely ruined the moment by pulling Vexther into an awkward hug that the former interrogator Prime clearly had no idea how to process. Take care of yourselves. She said, try not to torture anyone unless they really, really deserve it, she added, and even then maybe just use prison instead. She suggested. Vexter stood frozen until she released him and then managed a slight nod. The crew boarded their ship and prepared for departure while the Zeltheran technicians activated the artificial wormhole that would send them home. Lieutenant Webb sat at his navigation console and pulled up Earth's coordinates with visible relief. I never thought I would be so happy to see our terrible, violent planet again, he said. It is a pretty great, terrible, violent planet, though. Rodriguez noted, best terrible, violent planet in the galaxy. Dr. Okafor agreed. Captain Chen settled into her command chair and took one last look at the Zeltheran throne world through the view screen. You know what is funny? She said to no one in particular. We came here by accident. Got captured by an evil empire, started a rebellion, helped fight a civil war, and completely restructured their entire government, she listed, and we were just trying to find a new colony site. She finished. Do you think the company is going to believe our report? Webb asked. Absolutely not, Chen said, but we have video evidence. Rodriguez pointed out. They are still not going to believe it, Chen repeated. Fair point. Rodriguez conceded. The wormhole opened ahead of them like a tunnel through space itself, and the Perseverance accelerated. Toward it behind them, the Zeltheran Empire continued its painful transformation from a power built on fear to something that might eventually resemble a functional multi-species. Democracy, though, it would probably take a few decades, and several more minor civil wars to get there. Ahead of them lay Earth and home in the extremely awkward conversation, where they would have to explain where they had been and why they were 6 months late. Ship entered the wormhole, and reality twisted around them in ways that human brains were definitely not designed to process. When they emerged on the other side, they were greeted by the familiar sight of Earth's sun and the bewildered hails from traffic control asking where they had been, why their transponder had been offline. This is the Perseverance returning from extended survey mission. Chen responded, we got a little lost. She explained, to find a little lost. Traffic control replied like a few 100,000 light years lost. Chen said, but we are back now, she added cheerfully, and we have one hell of a story to tell. She finished. The Perseverance began its final approach to Earth. While the crew prepared to return to a world that had no idea it had just accidentally reshaped an entire galactic empire somewhere, very far away in a reformed council chamber, the Empress looked at reports of declining rebellion rates and increasing cooperation between species and wondered if perhaps the humans had done them a favor by being completely immune to intimidation and in holding cells throughout what was now being called the Cooperative Zeltharan Commonwealth. Former prisoners told stories about the humans who had shown them that fear was not eternal. They told their children and their children's children about beings who had walked through the Empire's worst horrors with tired eyes and stubborn hearts. They spoke of a species that had survived so much darkness in their own history that external darkness could not touch them.